For 13 years, Erich Kempka was the personal driver of Adolf Hitler. His closeness to the leader of the Third Reich made him a privileged witness of that era and one of the few survivors who witnessed the final collapse of the regime. He was there, in the destroyed corridors of the Chancellery, closely observing the final days of his boss, in an episode that already belongs to history. For Hitler, surrender was never an option. Like Mussolini, he refused to become a spectacle for his enemies. He shared that fatalistic vision and acted accordingly. Kempka saw it with his own eyes and recounted what he experienced as a common man trapped in extraordinary circumstances would. His testimony denies the escape versions and offers precise details about the final hours in Berlin. Was that end truly definitive, or did Hitler manage to escape before? The man at the wheel. On the 25th of February of 1932, in an office at the party headquarters in Essen, a telegram arrived addressed to the young driver. The message ordered his presence on the 26th of February in Berlin at the Hotel Kaiserhof to assist the private secretariat. His superior at that time, Gauleiter Terboven, had left for Berlin 2 days earlier to attend a session of the Reichstag, and the recipient of the telegram wondered if he had been the one who sent that order. He was completely unaware of the reason for this summons and did not imagine the importance it would have in his future. He travelled in a rigid third-class seat, and that journey seemed endless to him. Along the way, he mentally reviewed any possible mistake committed, but upon finding none, he supposed that the communication did not foretell anything unfavourable. When the train arrived at the Friedrichstrasse station in Berlin, he advanced through the crowd filling the streets until he reached Wilhelmsplatz. He paused for a few moments to observe the modern and elegant appearance of the Hotel Kaiserhof. Finally, he passed through the revolving door and entered a lobby full of distinguished men and women. He addressed a bellhop who, without asking questions, led him through carpeted hallways to the room of Bruckner, Adolf Hitler's assistant. After a brief greeting, Bruckner indicated that he should wait in the hall. There he discovered with surprise about 30 more people, coming from different regions of Germany, summoned by telegram to the same hotel. Everyone shared nervousness and expectation. Little by little he learned that these men performed similar functions. They were drivers for prominent members of the party. Each one supposed that this call meant something exceptional and waited to be chosen for a special mission. Finally, a notice had them moved to room 135. Led by a bellhop, they entered the room where Hitler resided and worked in Berlin. Instinctively, without anyone ordering it, they lined up in a semicircle according to height. He, the shortest, remained on the far left. Comparing his appearance with that of his better-presented colleagues, his hopes diminished. Bruckner announced the names while Hitler interviewed them one by one about their professional experience. His turn came and he answered, "Miner father in Oberhausen, 21 years old, driver for Gauleiter Terboven." Next, technical questions began about car brands, especially supercharged Mercedes, horsepower, learning to drive, and how to act on tight blind curves. The questions followed rapidly and demanded immediate answers, but he managed to answer correctly. He felt stunned by emotion and enthusiastic about the idea of driving throughout Germany, the man already considered the country's most relevant public figure. When his examination was over, Hitler shook his hand and said goodbye to the candidates, who anxiously awaited the decision. Bruckner explained that a new driver was needed for Hitler's personal service, in addition to Mr. Schreck, who already held that position. The chosen one would be notified later. Each attendee received 15 marks and was dismissed. Hours of uncertainty followed until, after receiving a telegram from the Brown House in Munich, Kempka was finally summoned and received by Julius Schreck, the Führer's personal driver, who introduced him to practicing with the powerful Mercedes. This is how his first trips to Berlin began. In the capital, he was presented to Hitler again. This time the conversation was more personal. Hitler was interested in his family and his previous life. A relationship of trust began there that was maintained during years of constant cohabitation. The presidential campaign was starting. He drove the guest's car, covering long distances every day. They arrived punctually at towns and cities where Hitler spoke and left immediately after each speech. He envied Schreck and was happy when he could replace him. Even after great speaking efforts, Hitler remained clear-headed and conversed with the driver. He personally prepared refreshments for the one at the wheel to prevent fatigue. With a map on his knees, he marked routes and calculated times to arrive punctually. The driver only had to guide and keep schedules. After several speeches in the north, they returned from Hamburg. Schreck suffered intoxication, and the next day Hermann Göring took his place. At dusk, they arrived in Stettin, and before retiring to the hotel, Hitler asked him to study his car to relieve Göring and take him that same night to Landsberg an der Warthe. The convoy departed between 2 and 3 in the morning, and in the morning they arrived at Liebenau Castle, where they were cordially received. Hitler excused himself and retired to rest in his room, while the escort and guests were entertained. Finally, a notice had them moved to room 135. Led by a bellhop, they entered the room where Hitler resided and worked in Berlin. Instinctively, without anyone ordering it, they lined up in a semicircle according to height. He, the shortest, remained on the far left. Comparing his appearance with that of his better-presented colleagues, his hopes diminished. Bruckner announced the names, while Hitler interviewed them one by one about their professional experience. His turn came, and he answered, "Meine Father in Oberhausen, 21 years old, driver for Gauleiter Terboven." Next, technical questions began about car brands, especially supercharged Mercedes, number of horsepower, learning to drive, and how to act on tight, blind curves. The questions followed rapidly and demanded immediate answers, but he managed to answer correctly. He felt stunned by emotion and enthusiastic about the idea of driving throughout Germany, the man already considered the country's most relevant public figure. When his examination was over, Hitler shook his hand and said goodbye to the candidates, who anxiously awaited the decision. Bruckner explained that a new driver was needed for Hitler's personal service, in addition to Mr. Schreck, who already held that position. The chosen one would be notified later. Each attendee received 15 marks and was dismissed. Hours of uncertainty followed until, after receiving a telegram from the Brown House in Munich, Kempke was finally summoned and received by Julius Schreck, the Führer's personal driver, who introduced him to practicing with the powerful Mercedes. This is how his first trips to Berlin began. In the capital, he was presented to Hitler again. This time the conversation was more personal. Hitler was interested in his family and his previous life. A relationship of trust began there that was maintained during years of constant cohabitation. The presidential campaign was starting. He drove the guest's car, covering long distances every day. They arrived punctually at towns and cities where Hitler spoke and left immediately after each speech. He envied Schreck and was happy when he could replace him. Even after great speaking efforts, Hitler remained clear-headed and conversed with the driver. He personally prepared refreshments for the one at the wheel to prevent fatigue. With a map on his knees, he marked routes and calculated times to arrive punctually. The driver only had to guide and keep schedules. After several speeches in the north, they returned from Hamburg. Schreck suffered intoxication, and the next day, Hermann Göring took his place. At dusk, they arrived in Stettin, and before retiring to the hotel, Hitler asked him to study his car to relieve Göring and take him that same night to Landsberg an der Warthe. The convoy departed between 2 and 3 in the morning, and in the morning they arrived at Liebenau Castle, where they were cordially received. Hitler excused himself and retired to rest in his room, while the escort and guests were entertained. He also supervised automobiles with special bodies intended to be gifted to foreign statesmen. He visited the factory frequently to check every detail. He usually dedicated only one day to this task and had to use the nights to fulfill the rest of his obligations. Hitler wanted constant reports on the progress and was keenly interested in technical innovations. On one occasion, he proposed building an armored car for Hitler. The latter rejected the idea, stating that no danger could come from the German people and that he did not believe foreign powers would attempt to assassinate him. He was convinced that they knew how much Europe depended on his role. The start of the war surprised him. As head of the motor pool, he was unprepared. From then on, he constantly thought about the armored car, and in 1939, despite the previous refusal, he ordered one on his own initiative, identical in appearance to the usual ones. When he spoke with Martin Bormann to cover the expenses, the latter refused, knowing that Hitler considered it unnecessary. He had to turn to solvent friends to pay for it. On the 8th of November of 1939, the assassination attempt against Hitler took place at the Bürgerbräukeller. That event gave him the opportunity to inform the chief about his armoured car. On the journey from Anhalt station to the Chancellery, he managed to convince Hitler to see it. Upon arrival, he ordered it brought out to the courtyard. Hitler examined it with interest while he explained that the glass had several layers with a total thickness of 45 millimeters. The sides had steel plates of 3.5 to 4 millimeters, and the floor had plates of 9 to 11 millimeters for protection against mines or explosives, sufficient against portable weapons and charges of 500 grams of dynamite. Hitler smiled at Bormann and said that from then on he would only use that car because someone with hostile intentions could always appear. Bormann had no choice but to pay for it. Shortly after, Hitler asked him to drive around Berlin at night in a simple Volkswagen without an escort. He liked those outings to see the capital's construction work without traffic. He did not want to delve into political matters in his memoirs, but he recorded what Hitler said that night upon stopping in front of the House of Tourism, under construction next to the Potsdam Bridge. He regretted the war because without it, Berlin and other cities of the Reich would soon have a new appearance. The armoured car finally excited Hitler, and he gave the order to commission several more. Later, he was commissioned to deliver them personally to foreign heads of state. In December of 1941, he took an armoured open-top Daimler-Benz 150 touring car to the Finnish Marshal von Mannerheim. During his stay in Finland, he observed the population's food shortage, and upon returning to Rastenburg, he reported to Hitler, who ordered 50,000 tons of wheat sent to the Finnish government. On the occasion of Mannerheim's 57th birthday, he was tasked with obtaining 3 Steyr all-terrain vehicles which he loaded in Stettin. On the day of the birthday, Hitler landed at a Finnish airfield, a demonstration was held, and he personally delivered the cars. In January of 1942, he arrived in Bucharest with an armoured limousine for Marshal Antonescu, who was sick with the flu. Despite his condition, the Marshal got up the next day to receive Hitler's gift from his hands. Upon returning from that mission, he was sent to Sofia to deliver another armoured car intended for the Bulgarian monarch. There he learned that the latter had fallen seriously ill after returning from an excursion and taking a cold shower. A few days later he died. He remained until his burial and a month later returned to deliver the vehicle to Prince Cyril, the king's brother and regent. He also delivered armoured cars to other heads of state of that era, some later proscribed or executed, including Quisling and the chief of Yugoslavia. Obersalzberg, the private circle surrounding Hitler. During the Easter of 1932, he went up to Obersalzberg for the first time. Access was difficult, especially if it had snowed. Cars could not go up, and the luggage had to be transported by sled while visitors walked up. Only Goebbels, due to his difficulty in walking, was carried on the sled. His wife and little Harold ascended on foot. At that time, the residence called Wachenfeld did not yet belong to the leader. He had recently rented it from Mrs. Winter, who had received it as a gift from her husband. It carried her maiden name. The dwelling was small and only provided space for a few people. Collaborators who came were housed in nearby inns, such as the Platterhof. The person who organized the house was the leader's sister, Mrs. Raubel, who took care of the kitchen and the cozy atmosphere. The place offered a tranquility that he valued greatly. In 1933, with the earnings from the book the leader signed, the property could be purchased. He himself designed the expansion, and thus the Berghof arose. Obersalzberg soon became a coveted destination for new constructions. One of the first to move was Martin Bormann. Seeking privacy, the leader had his property surrounded with a fence. When Bormann built his nearby home, he tried to persuade him to do without the fence, without success. The response was clear. That estate had been purchased with his money, and whatever he decided would be done there. In the autumn of 1936, Frau Raubal retired from the Berghof and shortly thereafter married Professor Hamish, who would end up dying in the war. Until the conflict began, several housekeepers, all already elderly, tried to take the position in the house, but none could endure the altitude. When the war started, it was Eva Braun who assumed management with the help of a young couple also in charge of the entrance. Eva had been working at Hoffmann's photographic studio in Munich. As her presence at the residence became usual, the leader would escape to Obersalzberg whenever he found time, both on weekends and during vacations. He would go hiking accompanied by his close associates. For him, this mountainous corner was the place he felt most like his own. The site became very well known and received a large number of visitors daily. Already in his time as Chancellor, the Berghof began to be used for official visits as well, with important figures such as kings, princes, or ambassadors, among them King Boris of Bulgaria. The security of Obersalzberg was the responsibility of a protection corps that answered to Himmler. This unit had arisen in 1933 and was dedicated to protecting government figures. Some of its first members came from the guard of the Bavarian President Held. Not all belonged to the SS, nor were all members of the party, but they remained with the leader until the end. A company of the Waffen-SS, which was renewed every 6 months, performed honor guard duties. With the war underway, the leader barely left his headquarters and only returned to the Berghof on a few occasions. Eva Braun remained there until March of 1945, when she left for Berlin to accompany him until the end. One of the most striking members of the leader's inner circle was the Dr. Theo Morell. Although one could not judge his professional expertise, his presence became key after obtaining concrete results. In 1938, Hoffmann became seriously ill, and the doctors gave up on him. It was then that Morell appeared, who managed to stabilize him. This episode generated great gratitude in the leader towards him, to the point of inviting him as an escort on his travels. Morell's arrival caused discomfort in the entourage. Without a formal position and with difficulty keeping up with the group's pace, his presence required special attention that few were willing to offer. During a visit in Innsbruck, after several consecutive events, the leader fell ill with flu symptoms. The duty doctor warned that he would not be able to speak the next day. It was then that Morell asked to examine him and promised him a quick recovery. He administered an injection, inhalations and hot compresses. The next day, the leader spoke normally. After that episode, Morell was offered the position of personal physician. He accepted, ceded his practice to a colleague, and integrated into the permanent circle. His treatment of everyone was friendly, regardless of rank. He gained the affection of soldiers but remained distant from high-ranking officials. He avoided social contact and focused only on his duty. He greatly enjoyed eating, although he neither smoked nor drank. He used vitamins above all, either in pill form or intravenously. He produced these preparations in his own laboratory. He obtained visible results in some cases, such as that of Assistant Krauss, who was ill before a trip, and Lady Mitford, who recovered after a severe lung ailment. During his captivity, the doctor recounted an episode that marked the origin of rumors about poisoning. Following the attempt of July 20th, 1944, the leader was treated by an ear specialist. This specialist, while waiting in the room, found a box of pills with the inscription anti-gas. They contained, among other substances, strychnine. Although the leader took them sporadically to relieve his stomach, the military doctor extracted some and sent them for analysis. Dr. Brand, who already had friction with Morell, was informed, made a call and manipulated the data, exaggerating the daily amount consumed. Based on erroneous calculations, Brand and 2 other doctors concluded that the chief was being deliberately poisoned. Brand notified Himmler, who came immediately. During a meal, Brand confronted Morell, accusing him directly. The latter went to speak with the chief, who downplayed the matter. When Himmler confronted him, the chief intervened and forbade him from meddling in that subject again. From then on, the implicated doctors were removed. The otolaryngologist was expelled from the headquarters, the surgeon was sent to the front, and Brand was vetoed from re-entry. Dr. Morell, already in prison, declined and passed away poor and sick in 1948. Martin Bormann, on the other hand, was a different type of figure. Calculating, cold, and with great capacity for work, he was considered one of the most hated by his entourage. They met him in 1932, still as head of insurance for the SA. He presented himself as helpful to his superiors and kind to his peers. He worked non-stop, and that earned him promotions. Hess chose him as assistant, and soon he was his right-hand man. His behavior changed in 1936, when he saw the opportunity to settle near the chief in Obersalzberg. He bought land under the pretext of expanding the leader's rest area. He claimed that the peasants wanted to sell, and he paid very high prices. In the end, he became the main owner of the area, after the chief. His next move was to appear occasionally at meals, ask permission to attend, and then excuse himself due to overwork. That tactic made the chief see him as the most diligent. That is how he obtained the administration of the Berghof, from where he expanded his influence. He treated his subordinates with ups and downs. He could show himself to be kind and generous, only to then humiliate them harshly. He fired and hired without restrictions. With those close to the chief, he was all smiles. He liked to build. He remodeled houses and prepared new accommodations. Among his most notable works was a tea room atop the Kehlstein, which was accessed by elevator. A failed visit to that place allowed him to open an investigation against Bruckner, whom he had wanted to remove for some time. He secured his retirement and then replaced the entire team of adjutants with personnel loyal to him. The one who remained officially in charge was Schaub, but without real weight. Bormann and Himmler maintained a false camaraderie. Behind the scenes, they competed fiercely. He also tried to damage the image of the narrator himself, but he never managed to displace him. When Hess flew to England, Bormann celebrated. The letter the latter left was interpreted as a naive act, not as betrayal. Appointed successor to Hess, he eliminated every trace of him, photos, books, mentions. He even asked to change the name of one of his sons, who was the godson of the former deputy. His obsession with control extended to everything. In a domestic episode, he punished his wife for a shirt and threw her out of the house with their children for 5 weeks. It was not easy for anyone to avoid him. Even ministers like Funk complained about his meddling in every meeting with the chief. To please the latter, he pretended to be a vegetarian, although he ate meat in secret. He gave up tobacco out of obedience. He commissioned book summaries to simulate reading and use them as conversation at the table. His only concern was Eva Braun, who escaped his control. Even so, he tried to hinder her. His influence grew until he became indispensable. He carried out any order with precision. He even displaced peasants in one night to clear a view. He planted an entire tree to offer shade during greetings to the public. Prague defenseless and the Eastern Front, the hidden face of power. While on the external front, Hitler accumulated victories with the reincorporation of the Saar, the annexation of Austria, and the taking of the Sudetenland, his attitude showed more confidence and security than ever. On the 15th of March of 1939, he received the order to immediately mobilize a column of all-terrain vehicles toward Dresden, with the instruction to maintain permanent liaison with said unit. That same day, the President of Czechoslovakia, Dr. Hácha, was going to arrive in Berlin. He picked him up at the Anhalt station using the automobile assigned to the diplomatic corps. Upon entering the courtyard of the new chancellery, the notes of the Czech anthem played. In front of the Leibstandarte SS troops, the President reviewed the guard and was personally greeted by Hitler at the main entrance. The conversations extended into the early morning of the 16th. The version circulated that the Czech leader, exhausted by the intensity of the discussions, had to be assisted by the Führer's personal doctor, Dr. Morel, who revived him with an injection of glucose combined with vitamins. That same morning, the first agreements were signed. One of the drivers in charge of Kempka took the president back to the station, as he wished to return to Prague as soon as possible. Following prior instructions, Kempka had already moved his convoy, composed of 10 all-terrain capable cars and 4 trucks, to a small station located in the border area between Saxony and Czechoslovakia. At 6:30 in the morning, Hitler departed from Berlin in a special train along with his military staff. Under an intense snowfall, they arrived at the border crossing, where the column of vehicles was already waiting for them. Kempka personally drove the Führer's car again, with the latter occupying the passenger seat. His car headed the convoy. At the border, customs agents from both countries were already informed and lifted the barriers without stopping any of the vehicles. The snowfall intensified, which forced them to drive with extreme caution. One of the trucks lost control and overturned off the road. There was no time to wait for help, so they unloaded its contents and distributed it among the others before continuing. Towards 4 in the afternoon, they entered Prague. The city continued with its usual activity, and the convoy's passage went practically unnoticed. The snowfall persisted heavily. The group headed directly to the Hradčin, the seat of the Czech executive. No one had been notified of their arrival, so they were not received when they arrived. They lodged in one of the side wings of the building, and shortly after, a section of the SS Engineer Battalion arrived. The rest of the unit had failed to advance due to the bad weather and ice on the roads. An hour later, President Hácha arrived from Berlin. Upon finding Hitler already installed, he expressed his surprise at the speed with which they had gotten ahead. Without delay, they resumed conversations, and the agreed-upon documents were signed. The next day, members of the Czech cabinet and several high-ranking army commanders went to the Hradčin, where they were formally presented to Hitler. At that moment, the only German military presence in Prague consisted of Hitler, his close team, and the mentioned unit of sappers. These soldiers came from a training section in Dresden. Their equipment was limited, So much so that the Führer's escort group had to hand over part of their automatic weapons to reinforce the newcomers. Thinking about that situation, Kempka kept remembering how easy it would have been for the Czech leaders and military commanders to arrest them all. They did not have heavy armament, and had they been confronted, they would have been easily subdued. On the afternoon of the 17th of March, they left Prague along with their column. On the way, they crossed paths with the first detachments of the German army heading to occupy the city. They returned to the initial point and, from there, took the train towards Vienna, where Hitler's arrival was expected. Some later accusations about Hitler's supposed cowardice did not correspond to what Kempka had personally witnessed at the front. A particularly clear experience was a flight to the Dnieper region in the winter of 1942 to 1943. In those days, the Soviet troops were concentrating their offensive to recover the Donetsk region, and the central objective was the large hydroelectric power plant in Zaporozhye. They landed at the airport located west of the city, since the eastern one had been taken by Russian armored units. The commanders insisted that Hitler must leave the location immediately, but he rejected that possibility. He wanted to verify the situation in person before acting. He did not agree to leave until 4 days had passed, once he considered having all the necessary information and having given the relevant instructions. At that moment, the airbase was already being attacked by Soviet aviation. From Zaporozhye they moved to Vinica, a point from which actions on the Eastern Front were coordinated during the summer, allowing for a quick reaction to any critical event. Although Kempka avoided making personal evaluations, he considered that he had to refute the claims made by some figures of the time who, in their memoirs, assured that Hitler kept far away from the fighting. He knew that those versions were not faithful to the facts. The High Command constantly warned him about the risk of moving too far from the headquarters, as this could affect the control of operations. On occasion he accepted those arguments, but if a crisis arose that, in his perception, required his direct presence, there was no way to persuade him. He drove his decision above any other consideration. Kempka clarified that his account did not seek to pass judgment on Hitler's role during the conflict. He did not consider himself qualified to establish historical valuations. That task corresponded to those who would study those facts in the future. He, except for some specific movements, spent most of his time with the leader in the various headquarters. Daily life there was simple, without luxuries. The routine began early and extended late into the night. Meanwhile, strategic decisions were in the hands of the main military leaders of the headquarters. The figures who had the greatest weight in military strategy were Keitel, Jodl, and the Chief of Staff of the army. Although Bormann had great influence in Hitler's entourage, he did not participate in the daily operational meetings before January of 1945. Even Himmler was excluded from those meetings for a long time, and only later was he allowed to join. Bormann's participation in those instances only solidified when Hitler moved his command center to the underground shelter in Berlin, marking the beginning of the final phase of the conflict. From that moment on, he was part of the daily military encounters, and everything indicates that he directly influenced the decision to continue the resistance with no possible surrender. The last treason, Himmler, Fegelein, and the Führer's end. Eva Braun arrived in Berlin a few days before Adolf Hitler's birthday. Although he had asked her not to, she decided to stay by his side until the end. On the 26th of April, Erich Kempka was able to speak with her for the first time since her arrival. She, whom he had known since 1932, calmly expressed her decision to remain in the capital, already knowing that the situation had no way out. Eva Braun recounted that Hitler had insisted that she leave by plane, but that she refused, saying she would share his fate. As Martin Bormann passed nearby, she commented that Hitler knew how he acted, but that in the middle of the conflict he could not replace him. She added that under other circumstances Bormann would have been removed. The bunker had already received direct hits, but the structures were holding up. The sentries were equipped with submachine guns and grenades in case they had to face infiltrators. In the north of the city the fighting had become hand-to-hand, with scarce German units and Volkssturm members with few weapons. Hopes placed in the forces of Wenck and Steiner had vanished. There was talk of streets full of casualties and charred armoured vehicles throughout the area. Spaces that once housed children and women had been transformed into makeshift medical rooms. Kempka, along with Dr. Haase, toured these areas visiting wounded acquaintances. On the 26th of April, Ritter von Greim was called to Berlin to assume command of the Luftwaffe in place of Hermann Göring. He arrived in a Fieseler Storch piloted by Hanna Reich. During the journey, the general was hit by enemy fire, and Reich took control to land near the Brandenburg Gate. Upon arrival, Greim was attended to, and Reich narrated the details of the flight to Hitler. As the general entered the office, Hanna was saying goodbye to Hitler, and Kempka had the opportunity to greet her. Then Reich met with Goebbels's children, dedicating time to entertaining them with games and songs. The next day, Hermann Fegelein called Kempka to ask for 2 vehicles intended for an intelligence mission. Furthermore, he requested that he keep a briefcase with important documents belonging to Himmler and himself, which he would hand over at 10 o'clock that night. Kempka, a friend of Fegelein's for a long time and aware of his closeness to Hitler, accepted without suspecting that he might be compromising his own safety. The officer left with the last available cars from the motor pool. Half an hour later, the vehicles returned without him, and the drivers explained that he had gotten out at the Kurfürstendamm to continue on foot. He was wearing his SS general uniform. Kempka presented himself at the bunker as agreed, shortly before the appointed time. The place was on alert, as the DNB agency had announced urgent information from the Reuter agency. Since the usual radio was not working, the transmissions depended on a station from the motorized column that had been set up in the coal storage area. The news stated that Heinrich Himmler had contacted Count Bernadotte with the intention of negotiating an exit with the Western Allies. It alleged that Hitler was isolated, had suffered a cerebral hemorrhage, and could not act with sound judgment. It was estimated that he had only a few hours of life left. The reaction was one of total shock. Martin Bormann, coming out of the meeting with the crumpled paper in his hand, commented that loyalty is not demonstrated with insignia. He immediately asked about Fegelein's whereabouts. Kempka told him about his call, his departure with the vehicles, and the pending delivery of the briefcase. The atmosphere was one of absolute nervousness. Fegelein had an impeccable reputation and was decorated with the highest distinctions. Hitler's personal assistants and Ambassador Huell requested doses of poison. It was known that Himmler had given the Reich leader cyanide some time ago. Shortly after, Fegelein's assistant returned to the Chancellery. When interrogated by Högel, chief of Reich security in the Chancellery, he explained that he had accompanied Fegelein to his residence, where the latter changed clothes and suggested that he do the same. The aide, distrustful, returned to his post in uniform. Fegelein had told him that his intention was to stay behind and then try to catch up with Himmler. Bormann ordered that any organization that might receive the communication should immediately attempt to locate him. Meanwhile, State Secretary Neumann officiated the wedding of 2 soldiers, with Hitler and Eva Braun as witnesses. The brides had arrived there fleeing the Soviet advance. Around midnight, a call was received from Fegelein from somewhere in Berlin. He communicated with his sister-in-law, Eva Braun, urging her to leave the city with Hitler. She rejected his proposal, warned him about the consequences of his actions, and asked him to return, but he refused. Shortly after, an individual attempting to leave through the coal storage area was stopped by a sentry. He claimed to be General Fegelein. The guard, knowing he was being sought, led him to Wilhelm Mohnke, responsible for the defense of the ministerial sector. Fegelein was wearing civilian clothes and explained that he had gone to his room to retrieve the briefcase. Mohnke handed him over to Högel, who took his statement. The briefcase contained documents that confirmed the betrayal of Himmler and himself, and which had given rise to the news released by Reuter. Fegelein confessed that after picking up the papers, he planned to leave the bunker again. Upon searching his room, they found a trunk with a hidden compartment. Inside, 2 rolls of large British gold coins and bundles of English and American banknotes. It was a considerable sum. The contents of that hiding place would have ended up in enemy hands when the Chancellery fell. Hitler ordered an immediate court-martial. The decision was to condemn Fegelein for treason and have him shot. He received the sentence without flinching. When presenting it to Hitler for his signature, he hesitated for a moment. He was aware that this was Eva Braun's brother-in-law and an officer with brave combat records. Eva Braun, however, mentioned the call from that same night and suggested that Fegelein and Himmler wanted to surrender them. She insisted that any family ties be set aside. Hitler signed. The officer was executed in the garden of the Foreign Office by men who had been under his command. A little before, in a separate room of the bunker, one of the ampoules delivered by Himmler was tested. The effect was immediate, and a single look among those present was enough to understand that it worked as expected. The streets of Berlin had blockades with half-buried tanks. Amid the bombing, the population lined up to get food or clothing. The first looting began. The anti-aircraft defense joined the ground combat, while Soviet infantry and armored vehicles advanced street by street. On the 28th of April, Grime left the capital on a flight that was again under the charge of Reich. The takeoff was more complicated than the landing, with projectiles exploding nearby. Even so, they managed to take off and arrive without incident. That same day, preparations began for the wedding between Hitler and Eva Braun. In the leader's office, the testaments were dictated first. Secretary Traudl Juncker took the dictation for the first time. Then the marriage was celebrated. Present were Goebbels, Bormann, Huell, Mrs. Christian, Axmann and von Below. A lawyer took charge of the ceremony while explosions rumbled. Hitler and Eva Braun stood facing the table. The witnesses were Goebbels and Bormann. After a few brief words about marital obligations, they signed. Then there was a small reception. The attendees conversed naturally, knowing that soon Hitler and his wife were going to die. They recalled past stories. The news of the marriage spread slowly. Many did not even know of Eva Braun's existence. Some wondered why Hitler had waited so long to marry. But those who were aware knew that she had been the constant figure in the leader's private life. Always discreet, she avoided exposure. She never appeared at military meetings or public events. In the early hours of the 29th of April, Goebbels and Bormann were discussing the formation of the new government with Hitler. Hitler asked Goebbels to take over as Chancellor and Dönitz as interim president. Then he invited Goebbels to leave Berlin with his family, but he refused. He argued that as the person responsible for the city's defense, he could not leave. The discussion escalated. Goebbels left the office and dictated his testament to Juncker. That same day, Kempka was called by Hitler. Dressed in his usual clothes, the leader seemed calm. He held a map in his right hand and his left arm trembled as in recent months. He asked how things were. Kempka explained that he had organized the defense between the Brandenburg Gate and Potsdam Square. Hitler asked about the morale of his men, and upon hearing that they trusted Wenck, he nodded silently with a serious gesture. That night, the testaments of Hitler and Goebbels were signed. Lorenz, Below and Zander received the mission to take copies to Dönitz. They left by different routes. Kempka received another order, to send 2 messengers on motorcycles with a message for Wenck. The text, signed by Bormann and Bergdorf, said that time was pressing. 2 Sachs motorcycles were obtained. The emissaries, dressed in civilian clothes, left by different routes towards Fersch near Potsdam. One was detained in Grunewald. Although he showed documents signed by Bormann, he was accused of desertion. He was taken from post to post where no one recognized the signatories. Finally, after a call to the Chancellery, he was released. The second messenger never returned. The final order: incinerate the Führer. At noon on the 30th of April of 1945, Soviet grenades fell ceaselessly on the Ministry District and struck the interior of the Reich Chancellery. The combat intensified, the structures collapsed with a roar, and the streets were covered with rubble and dust. In that climate, Adolf Hitler moved from person to person inside the bunker, shaking hands and quietly thanking them for their effort and loyalty. The secretaries Traudl Juncker and Gerda Christian, along with Constanze Manziali, responsible for his diet, were invited to share lunch. Eva Braun sat by his side, and during the meal he held a light conversation so that everyone could participate. When they finished and the guests retired, Otto Günscher made them return. Hitler and Eva were waiting for them in the doorway of the antechamber. Eva hugged the collaborators of years and shook their hands. Then Hitler said goodbye to Martin Bormann and his adjutant Günscher, to whom he gave private instructions that he did not reveal at that time. Both understood the gravity of what was about to happen. At that moment, Erich Kempka was in a sector of the underground garage that had not yet suffered major damage. He had just entered after checking the relief of the sentries when the phone rang. When he picked up, he identified himself. It was Otto Günscher. With a tense voice, he asked if there was any bottle of spirits. The request surprised Kempka, as in those days no one felt like drinking. Günscher insisted and added that he would come immediately. Kempka looked for a bottle of cognac and left it ready. Half an hour passed without his arrival. The phone rang again. Günscher's voice, hoarse and emotional. immediately demanded 200 litres of gasoline. At first, Kempka thought it was a joke and tried to make him understand that he was asking for the impossible. But the voice became more insistent. "Gasoline, enrich, gasoline." Kempka asked what he wanted it for, but Günscher replied that he could not say it over the telephone and that he had to take it immediately to the entrance of the Führer's bunker, even if it meant moving everything to get it. Kempka explained that he could only obtain fuel in the Tiergarten, where thousands of litres were buried, but that with the current bombing it would be suicide for his men. He begged him to wait until the Russian fire eased around 5 in the afternoon. Günscher answered that he could not wait even 1 hour and ordered that everything possible be extracted from the tanks of the damaged cars and sent with jerrycans. In the garage there were vehicles crushed by the collapses, but not set on fire. Kempka ordered his lieutenant to gather all available gasoline with several men and take it to the indicated point. He himself hurried to meet Günscher, jumping over debris and wrecked cars. Upon entering the bunker, he saw Günscher leaving Hitler's office. His appearance had completely changed. He was pale and looked like a dead man. Kempka asked him what was happening. "You have endangered 6 men to bring me fuel in the middle of this bombing." Günscher seemed not to hear him, closed the door, looked at him with wide eyes and said, "The chief is dead." Kempka was paralyzed. He asked how it was possible if he had seen him apparently whole the day before. Günscher, unable to utter a word, raised his hand in a gesture that left no doubt and pointed to the closed door. In broken phrases, he recounted what had happened. The chief had ended his life inside the office, and Eva Braun had decided to accompany him in that fate. Those present called the doctor and the closest people to confirm what had happened. One of Kempka's men arrived to report that there were between 160 and 180 litres of gasoline at the bunker entrance. At that moment, Heinz Linger, Hitler's personal orderly, appeared, demanding the fuel. Kempka replied that it was ready. Linger disappeared behind the door, and then came out accompanied by Dr. Stumpfegger, carrying between the two of them Hitler's body wrapped in a grey quartermaster's blanket. The face was covered up to the nose, and under the very greying hair the pale forehead showed. One arm had come out of the blanket and hung limply down to the elbow. Behind them went Martin Bormann, carrying Eva Braun, dressed in black with her blonde head hanging backward. The scene deeply impacted Kempka. Eva Braun had had serious conflicts with Bormann for discovering his intrigues, and now her greatest enemy was carrying her dead. Kempka decided it should not happen like that. He ordered Günscher to help carry the chief and took Eva's corpse in his own arms. Upon feeling it, he noticed the left side was damp, and for a moment he thought she had also been shot, but then he learned that when Hitler fell, he had knocked over a vase with flowers, and the water had soaked the woman. Kempka stumbled on the access steps while carrying Eva Braun's body. Fatigued, he was forced to stop until Günscher came to help him. Between the two of them, they managed to carry her outside, where the roar was unbearable, and the explosions covered the area with dust and fragments. Near the exit, Stumpfegger and Ling had already left Hitler's corpse, lying next to a cement mixer. It was covered with a grey blanket that showed the legs extended toward the corridor. Eva was placed next to her husband, although in a slightly deviated position. The detonations continued without pause, and Kempka decided to return underground to get some air. Minutes later, he came out with a jerrycan, approached the bodies, and arranged the Führer's arm over his chest. The wind moved his hair. He removed the lid of the container while more projectiles fell, forcing them to take momentary shelter at the bunker entrance. When the fire subsided, Kempka went out again and poured the contents of the jerrycan over the corpses, overcoming his revulsion and fulfilling Hitler's last order. Beside him, Günscher and Linger were doing the same with additional jerrycans. The mixer had formed a depression at that spot where the fuel accumulated and was absorbed by the clothes. Again and again they entered the shelter to collect more jerrycans while grenades fell. Dr. Goebbels, Bormann and Stumpfegger were there without daring to go out. They sought a way to start the combustion. One proposal was immediately discarded, and instead a more discreet method was improvised with what was at hand. After lighting it, the flame caught the fuel and a dark column rose. Those present watched in silence as the fire carried out its duty. In the end, they rendered a final salute and moved away visibly shaken. The flames exhausted the fuel. It was impossible to add more while it was burning, so they had to wait until it was extinguished before continuing. The operation lasted from 14 to 1930. During the afternoon, Kempke's men managed, under extreme conditions, to get several hundred more litres of gasoline. When they returned to the shelter, they found Hitler's inner circle gathered there. Many went up to pay tribute to the dead chief and his wife. Tears were seen on hard faces like that of SAS Brigade Führer Wilhelm Mohnke, commander of the sector, Police General Rattenhuber and others. Although many awaited that moment, the confirmation fell like a blow. The serenity that had reigned until then disappeared, and discouragement overwhelmed them. The first to compose himself was Dr. Goebbels. He called Bormann, Bergdorf, Krebs and Mohnke to discuss the situation. Günscher and Kempke entered the room where the death had occurred again. They saw Ava's and Hitler's pistols on the red carpet, bloodstains on the table and floor, and the overturned vase. Opposite them hung a youthful portrait of Hitler's mother, and on the desk, an image of Frederick the Great. Kempke, lost in thought, went out to carry out his duties. In the antechamber of the medical room, he found Magda Goebbels sitting at a table with a heartbroken expression. She asked him to sit for a moment and told him about her farewell to Hitler. She said that she had fallen to her knees begging him not to take his own life, and that he had stood her up with serenity, explaining that he had to leave this world to allow Karl Dönitz to save what remained of Germany. Kempke tried to distract her by talking about the possibility of evacuating the Goebbels family with 3 armoured cars that he still had. She seemed relieved and accepted the idea. At that moment, Joseph Goebbels entered. Magda presented the escape plan to him, but he rejected it. He explained that he would send General Hans Krebs as a negotiator to the Soviet General Zhukov to try and arrange a way out. If it failed, he would remain in Berlin because he did not wish to become a permanent fugitive. He added that his wife and children were free to leave. Magda replied that she would follow her husband's path. Kempke entered the room where the head of the escort, Franz Schädler, was gravely wounded, and told him what he had just heard. During the conversation, Günscher and the criminal director Högel entered with new orders. Mohnke directed that Kempke and his men should go to the coal storage area of the new chancellery at 21 hours to attempt an exit, even fighting if necessary. Schädel stated that after their departure, he would shoot himself in the head to avoid being taken prisoner, and that is what he did when the time came. The last march, Bormann, Stumpfegger and the fire of the encirclement. When the meeting concluded, where Joseph Goebbels, Wilhelm Bergdorf, Martin Bormann, Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Mohnke had defined the terms of the proposal to be transmitted to General Georgy Zhukov, General Krebs departed for the Soviet positions as an emissary. Hours passed, and by nightfall he had still not returned. Faced with this prolonged absence, Mohnke decided to postpone the escape attempt by 24 hours. It was past midnight when Krebs finally returned to the Chancellery. He reported to Goebbels that Zhukov would accept nothing other than unconditional surrender. The only result he had obtained was the commitment that prisoners and the wounded would be treated according to the rules of the Geneva Convention. With that report, any doubt was closed. The decision would no longer be modified. The escape plan was set for the 1st of May at 21 hours. No one expected a different outcome. Everyone understood that there were only 2 possible outcomes: to cross the Soviet positions alive or to fall in the attempt. Meanwhile, the presence of enemy soldiers in the Tiergarten intensified every day, making it increasingly difficult to hold the position until the designated time to leave. In the midst of that grim situation, Erich Kempke, Hitler's driver and responsible for transport organization, could not help but direct his thoughts toward Magda Goebbels and her children. The woman had preferred to remain with her husband, and there was no turning back. The driver wondered if there was any way to save the little ones from the approaching tragedy. Although the military situation was desperate and the city was crumbling, some people continued to seek gestures of humanity amidst the chaos. Kempke witnessed how, even in those final hours, emergency weddings were celebrated between soldiers and their partners in brief ceremonies organized in improvised corners of the bunker. Shortly after the wedding, Kempke received the news of an outcome that many feared. The children of the Goebbels couple were no longer alive. It was known that, with the imminent fall of Berlin, the minister himself sought several doctors in the bunker to prevent the little ones from falling into Soviet hands. After several attempts, only one agreed to fulfill his request, and thus what the others had refused was consummated. Next, the final preparations for the departure were carried out. All unnecessary luggage was abandoned. Even some personal items that Eva Braun had distributed shortly before dying were left behind. At 20:45, the operation to incinerate the Goebbels couple began, directed by the minister himself. The men and women who wished to flee were organized into several groups. Kempka had about 30 women under his command. Before the departure, he descended into the bunker again to say goodbye to the Goebbels couple. Despite the recent death of their children, both showed a calmness that was disconcerting. Magda Goebbels, in a low voice, asked him not to forget what he had seen, even if no one ever asked about them again. With the arrival of night, the groups began to leave the Chancellery. They crossed the deserted Wilhelmsplatz, went into the subway, and walked through the tunnel toward Friedrichstrasse. After approximately 1 hour of walking, they reached the station. There they encountered a crowd of exhausted soldiers, untreated wounded and fugitives lying along the walls and stairs. The majority seemed to have given up any hope of escape. Kempka left the station alone to explore a possible route to the north. He had orders to reach Fehrbellin with his group, composed of about 100 people, and join some units still fighting there. Advancing to the Weidendam Bridge, he found a barricade. The defenders told him that some groups had managed to cross the cordon at that point, although others had been repulsed with heavy losses. Kempka looked over the barrier and confirmed that the street was covered with dead and wounded. In the direction of Wegeistrasse, the Soviets had caused a large-scale fire to illuminate the area and keep Friedrichstrasse under surveillance. The men at the barricade explained that the enemies had entrenched themselves in the ruins and dominated the entire street with automatic fire. Kempka reorganized his group and pointed to the Admiralspalast as the new meeting point, authorizing each one to try to escape with any other unit. Around 2 in the morning, Kempka saw a small group approaching. Among them, he identified Martin Bormann, dressed in an SS Obergruppenführer uniform. He was accompanied by Dr. Neumann, Goebbels' adjutant, SS Hauptsturmführer Schwegemann, and Dr. Stumpfegger. They had left the Chancellery shortly after Kempka's group. Kempka immediately asked Schwegemann about the fate of Goebbels and his wife. He replied that both had followed the same determination taken by Hitler and Eva Braun. The situation did not allow for going into detail. Immediately, Bormann discussed with Neumann and Kempka the need to have armoured vehicles to cross the cordon. Kempka pointed out that probably none were left available in that area. However, shortly after, they heard the noise of approaching tank tracks. To everyone's surprise, 3 Type 4 tanks appeared, accompanied by 3 other armoured transport vehicles. The commanding officer introduced himself as an SS Obersturmführer, obeying orders to head north with the remnants of a tank company from the Nord Division. Kempka explained the situation to him and arranged for them to advance slowly to provide cover until they reached Ziegelstrasse. The fugitives grouped around the vehicles and began to advance crouching. Bormann and Neumann marched on the left, next to the turret of the first tank. Kempka followed behind, accompanied by Stumpfegger. The tension was unbearable. Everyone was aware that they were risking their lives in that attempt. Suddenly, enemy fire erupted strongly. A flash of fire sprang from the side of the armoured vehicle leading the column. The explosion threw Bormann and Neumann into the air. Kempka lost his balance, and Stumpfegger was violently thrown against him. At that moment, Kempka fell unconscious under the roar of the detonation. Fleeing Berlin, the driver who denied the escape. When Erich Kempka came to, he did not know how much time had passed since the explosion. His eyes were still blinded by the intense brightness of the blast, and for an instant he thought he had lost his sight. Little by little he tried to move, feeling around him, and his mind began to respond again. The explosion had thrown him among the debris covering the street. Unable to see clearly, he advanced crawling with effort, covering several meters until he bumped against a wall. Upon touching it, he understood that it was the barricade from which they had attempted the failed exit. He remained there for a moment, catching his breath, as his senses slowly adjusted to the darkness interrupted by flashes. Shortly after, he began to distinguish shapes, and upon raising his gaze he observed a man staggering toward him. He approached and recognized him. It was Georg Beetz, Hitler's second pilot, who had also participated in the evasion. Kempka shuddered upon seeing the deep wound crossing his head, opened by shrapnel from the forehead to the back. Beetz, with a muffled voice, explained that he had suffered that injury when the vehicle that had thrown him, Martin Bormann, Neumann, Stumpfegger and Kempka himself into the air, exploded. The two advanced slowly, leaning on each other, in the direction of the Admiralspalast. Upon arriving near the Weidendam Bridge, Beetz could no longer continue. Kempka settled him in an abandoned handcart, and with relief saw the arrival of Dr. Käthe Hausermann, assistant to Hitler's personal dentist, Professor Blaschke. He asked her for help and went out to look for medical supplies in the Admiralspalast. Between the two of them, they bandaged the wounded man. Beetz's condition made it impossible to get him out of Berlin. Hausermann promised to take him to her apartment and care for him, but later Kempka learned that he had died shortly after he had left. Convinced that there was no longer any way to escape as a group, Kempka decided to disband the formation he still preserved. He ordered that each person should look for civilian clothes and try to escape on their own by crossing the enemy lines. Having fulfilled what he considered his last military duty, he thought only of his own survival. With 7 men, he returned to the Friedrichstrasse station and climbed onto the elevated train tracks with the intention of reaching the Leert station. They soon understood that this route was blocked. The track was under intense fire from Soviet troops. They went down again and found a set of warehouses built under the metal structure. Kempka cautiously entered one of them and found several foreign women workers accompanied by labourers. They warned them that they should get rid of their uniforms if they wanted to keep their lives. A young Yugoslavian woman handed Kempka a used overall and told him to change in an attic, hiding the military clothing among old radiators. His companions also received civilian garments. While he was getting dressed, Kempka saw the severity of his injuries on his right arm for the first time. Exhausted, he felt the need to sleep for an instant to regain his strength. Just as he lay down, he heard voices and footsteps. From the trapdoor, he saw a large group of Soviet soldiers enter, who had discovered the hiding place of the labourers. The military men were celebrating noisily, embracing each other and showing jubilation. Kempka, overwhelmed by total apathy, was barely aware of the immediate danger. The same young Yugoslavian woman shouted at him to come down. He had no other option but to obey. He approached the soldiers along with the foreign workers. The young woman took him by the hand and introduced him to a Soviet commissar, claiming he was her husband. The officer looked at him briefly, hugged him and exclaimed victory phrases. Berlin was destroyed, Hitler was defeated, and Stalin was the great leader. The Soviets offered vodka, bread, canned meat and butter. Kempka called his comrades to come down from the attic, as the commissar also wished to greet them. After some time, the Soviets abandoned the place and the fugitives returned to the attic. The tension of those hours had left them exhausted. They dropped onto the planks and managed to sleep for a short period. After an hour, Kempka woke up restless. He decided it was time to eliminate any trace that could identify them. He woke the others and ordered them to burn all personal documents, military identification cards, and papers that could betray them. He himself added his standard and the pennant of his vehicle to the fire. Having become simple civilians without military identity, they understood that they could not move together. A group would easily be detected. Kempka said goodbye to the last comrades he had left. Each one would have to attempt the escape separately. Upon leaving the shelter, Kempka again encountered the same Soviet soldiers. They greeted him with joyful shouts and told him they were heading back to the warehouse. He was forced to accompany them. There he was, received once more by the young Yugoslavian woman, who greeted him with a smile. The commissar announced that the occasion had arrived to celebrate the victory with a great party. They brought abundant alcohol and food, and the festivities began under the train tracks. While the Russians were drinking, Kempka thought about the ruins of the Chancellery, where he had seen the destruction of his world fully accomplished. Hitler and Eva Braun had been buried there, and the memories of that moment were still fresh. Despite this, he was forced to participate in the toasts so as not to arouse suspicion. The commissar, already drunk, invited him to dance with his supposed Yugoslavian wife. During the dance, Kempka noticed how the blood from his wounds was filtering through his sleeve. He hid his hand in his pocket to conceal it. Finally, the party ended, and the young Yugoslavian woman showed unexpected bravery. Taking a risk, she guided Kempka and a Hungarian baroness who had joined them through guarded streets, avoiding Soviet patrols until they reached Tegel. She left them there to return to her compatriots. Kempka never understood why that unknown young woman decided to help him. He remembered her figure as that of a woman who had shown more courage than many men. On the 30th of May, he reached the city of Wittenberg. He swam across the Elbe River and continued his journey through Weimar, Nuremberg and Munich until he reached Berchtesgaden. No one stopped him during that journey. Along the way, a German interpreter employed by the Allies provided him with documents under his name, which allowed him to travel without setbacks to his destination. In Berchtesgaden, he rested with his wife for 1.5 days. He believed he had reached the end of an exhausting effort, but he was soon reported. His intention was to voluntarily present himself to the authorities as the chief of Hitler's motor pool, once recovered, but he did not get the chance. That same night he was arrested by agents of the American CYC, and after a 12-hour interrogation, he was admitted to the Berchtesgaden prison. Since then, a long journey through concentration and internment camps began. In each transfer, the officers interrogated him, trying to obtain information about the fate of Hitler and his closest collaborators. The questions were always the same and the pressure unceasing. Kempka acknowledged that, in general, he had received correct and even cordial treatment from some officers, but none accepted the simplicity of his account of Hitler's death. What they did believe was his testimony about the death of Goebbels and his family, because the Soviets had already officially confirmed the discovery of the bodies. On the other hand, it was inconceivable to them that Hitler had died in the manner described by his chauffeur. The interrogators insisted on rumors about submarines prepared for an escape, or pilots with secret orders to transfer him abroad. Kempka could only deny those stories. During those sessions, he recalled a conversation with Hitler in 1933, shortly after the latter assumed power. On one of the car trips, Hitler had calmly told him that he would never leave there alive. Kempka, who had witnessed his incineration in the Chancellery Garden, considered all those speculations useless. In 1946, after passing through Darmstadt, he was transferred in a military vehicle to Nuremberg to testify in the trial. They had called for him by radio for 2 days. Before presenting himself, an American officer checked his clothing and gave him a new tie so that he would appear with a proper appearance. That afternoon he remained in a guard room without being called. The night in the cell was uncomfortable. A reflector placed in the peephole illuminated him relentlessly. The next day, in the middle of the morning, he was led before the court and gave a statement under oath. The prosecutors asked him for details about the last days of the regime. The American prosecutor commented, surprised, that he seemed to have been everywhere. Kempka responded by relating what he had seen as a close witness to Hitler. Almost all the other direct witnesses had died or were under Soviet control. Therefore, the judges wanted to extract every detail. Kempka concealed nothing and repeated precisely what had happened, without altering facts or adding interpretations. After almost a month in the Nuremberg prison, he was sent to the Langwasser camp with the intention of being released. However, since the releases had already concluded there, he was transferred to Regensburg and then to Ludwigsburg. During that last journey, he suffered a serious truck accident, the consequences of which he would drag for life. In October of 1947, he was definitively released. Years of captivity and interrogations had passed. Kempka knew that the German people had suffered enormously, and that the memory of Hitler would continue to be a subject of debate for generations. For him, what happened was closed in those final days in Berlin, when he saw him consumed in flames in the Chancellery Garden.